Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And right across from me over in Memphis, Tennessee, is William Bell of All Things Fulfilled. William, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, Don. Been a long, long day. I don't think I stopped until maybe 3 or 4 this afternoon from getting up around 5 o'clock, and it's been nonstop. Automobile issues,
Uh,
medical issues, one thing after the other, and but finally got a chance to sit down after a while, so
well, that's
I'm
good.
good now.
My day started at about 1:30. I could not go back to sleep. And, it's just like, I don't know why I'm doing this. I mean, I've only got 11 projects going on in my life, but nonetheless, and so needless to say, about 11 o'clock, I kind of crashed, took a little bit of a nap. And so that helped me a little bit. But as I shared with you
Mhm.
just before coming on the air, um, Jan and I went to eat somewhere at 2:30. I don't know exactly what time it was. Yeah, it was 2:30, 3 o'clock. And all of a sudden, Mr. Kidney Stones started rattling around. I know that I've got one, perhaps two, in the kidney, and they they periodically, rattle around a little bit, and they let me know that they're there. They make me feel really, really bad because they release toxins. Your kidneys start trying to fight them and all this kind of stuff. And so you have toxins being released into your system, and you just feel like a truck ran over you. So I haven't felt good since that happened. And I'm just, I've passed 13 kidney stones in my life. And I would just prefer to leave it right there. Don't want any more. They say three's a charm. Well, I want to tell you something. 13 has nothing to do with anything charming. No, no fun at all.
I
So
know they have to be painful.
they are absolutely awful. And then to cap it off, Jan's got a kidney stone rattling around. So we're we've got twins working at our house right now. Anyway, it'll be all right. As they always say concerning kidney stones, it'll all come out in the wash,
Uh,
somehow or the other. But boy, it's no fun. So anyway, William, last week as we closed out and we did last week we kind of gave a rundown on our travels and what we've been involved in lately, and a lot of people seem to enjoy that. And as we closed out, I said what I would like for us to do this evening is to investigate the dispensational view of the interim, or what they call the replacement theology doctrine. And I want to examine that in the light of the Abrahamic inheritance. Now, we've touched on number one, the identity of the Abrahamic inheritance, that it involved Abraham's inheritance of the world, a heavenly city, a heavenly country, and a better resurrection. So all of that given, we have examined a couple of weeks ago. We examined the fact that the Abrahamic inheritance would be given at the end of the law of Moses. Galatians 3:16 to 22 is emphatic on this. The Abrahamic inheritance could not be received under the law or by means of the law, but it would be given after the law passed away. The law was the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. After the inheritance, or after the faith has come, we're no longer in schoolmaster, Paul said in Galatians 3:24. So I wanted to do all of that, to examine all of that and compare it with the dispensational view of the Abrahamic inheritance. I want to examine their entire view, their narrative of eschatology that has to do with the rapture, the tribulation, second coming, millennium, new creation, etc. Would you care to lay that narrative out for us in a little more detail?
That's a lot.
Well, yeah.
Well, when I think of what they um, argue in terms of um, their view, it is that um, the prophets, had prophesied that Christ would come, that the kingdom would come, etc. However, because of rejection, that the Jews rejected him, there was a change of plans. And so the church then became an interim for um, God's failure, or the failure of the law and the prophets in terms of what they had originally set forth. The church became this interim replacement until at some point in time in the future, when God will ultimately save Israel. And so you have, these other doctrines of, some of which that you've mentioned here, that they have inserted in the program. And as a result of that, they teach that, the church, the postponement of the kingdom, et cetera, is what we're dealing with now. And we're waiting ultimately for the fulfillment of, God's promises to Israel.
Yeah, and let me fill that in just a tiny bit here. That's absolutely correct. But not only do they believe that Jesus offered the kingdom, and you touched on it, he offered the kingdom, but they rejected it, and that made it impossible. That's Thomas Ice's own word in the book End Time Controversy, page 115.
Mm-hmm.
That the Jewish rejection of Jesus's offer of the kingdom made it impossible for Jesus to establish the kingdom. Now, William, I want to dwell on this for just a moment. If Leora tells you, William, I want you to run down to Walmart, and gives you a list of 5 things. I want you to go down to Walmart and get these 5 things. And you go down to Walmart and you don't come back with a single one of those 5 items. Now, I'm not going to ask you what Leora is going to say, but would she and you consider your trip to Walmart a failure to fulfill what you were sent to do?
Oh, absolutely. It would be a failure. No dinner on the table.
And didn't I send you down there to get these 5 items? Well, yes. Well, why didn't you get them? I don't know. Got sidetracked. I don't know. But look here, I got cantaloupe and watermelon and this and that and the other. Well, it's not what I sent you after.
Right.
Okay, so I have asked many, many dispensationalists, and I've tried to do this as kindly and tactfully as possible. Why do you teach a doctrine of failure? Every single one of them have said, I don't believe Jesus failed. And yet you ask them, okay, did he come to establish the kingdom? Yes. Did he offer the kingdom? Yes. Was he able to fulfill the promises, to fulfill the offer and establish the kingdom? No. Why? Because the Jews rejected it. So he wasn't able to do what the Father sent him to do. He wasn't able to do what he came to do. Yeah. Well, then he failed. No, he didn't. And that's how that conversation generally goes until I've had it happen, until all of a sudden the lights come on and they realize, yes, indeed, they are teaching a failed Messiah. I told Thomas Ice in my formal debate with him in Florida in 2008, Thomas, you cannot say that Jesus came at just the right time. That's what the Bible affirms. He came at just the right time. You cannot affirm that he came at just the right time and he came to establish the kingdom, But due to Jewish unbelief, he was unable to do it without teaching a doctrine of failure. And he said, no, it's not what I teach. And I said, Thomas, you can't deny that. A failure to do what you came to do, what you were sent to do, is failure. Well, he just adamantly refused to even acknowledge that. But whether he acknowledges it or not, it's true. So if there are any dispensationalists watching this program, whether tonight, in the morning, or whatever, in the coming weeks and months and even years, it's my hope and my prayer that you will give serious thought to what dispensationalism actually teaches. It teaches a failed Messiah. I've had countless ones of them saying, well, it's just a change of plan in regard to timing. Well, yeah, it is. It's a change of plan. But Daniel 9 set the time. Daniel 2 set the time. Daniel 7 set the time. And that time is come and gone. So that they offer every excuse in the world to justify Jesus not doing what he came to do when he came to do it. And that, to me, is just an incredibly sad doctrine. What's your assessment of that, William? I think I know what it is.
Of course. I mean, I totally agree that, here they are claiming that they believe the scriptures and that they are, following God's plan. And then at the time when it's supposed to be executed, he fails. And then they are the ones who have to come up and try to, reroute the process, try to remake the whole scenario to fit a paradigm that they have, because they can't understand, number one, how it's been fulfilled, and number two, it just upsets their total apple cart, so to speak, of what they do teach. So it's really a sad commentary on believing the scriptures, what they state, and the purpose of God. It certainly cast a huge reflection on God and Christ and his purposeful coming, and just basically makes mockery of the scripture, I would say.
Well, I agree with that 100%. And when I reflect on Psalms chapter 2, why do the heathen rage?
Mm-hmm.
Why do the nations gather themselves against the Lord and against his anointed one? And come, let us set ourselves in array against him. And he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. He shall hold them in derision, saying, yet, and that's got to be one of the biggest three-letter words in all the Bible. Yet, it's kind of like the word but. It's a little bit like the word if. Yet have I set my king on my holy hill Zion. So here is Yahweh the Father saying, the Jews are going to do their worst.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to do their best to prevent the enthronement of my Messiah. I'm going to laugh at them. And you have Isaiah 42, verses 1 to 6. He, that is Messiah, will not fail nor be discouraged until he has established justice and judgment in the world. Here's a text that just absolutely affirms Jesus was not going to fail in his mission. And then you have Psalms 89, 34 to 37. The Lord said, I have sworn by myself. I have sworn an oath. I will not alter the word that is gone out of my mouth. I will set the seed of David on the throne and establish it as the sun and the moon and the stars. And so here is God saying, you know what? I'm not going to change my plan. So here you have the dispensational paradigm saying God changed the plan. He changed it from the first century to here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting on that plan to be fulfilled. And I'll tell a real quick anecdote here, William. In my very first formal public debate, which was in 1983 with a guy by the name of Don Deal. Pardon me, the debate was held in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And I was talking about the delay, the postponement, the failure of Christ. And he got up there and he said, it's not a failure. It's not a postponement, even. It's just a slight alteration of plans. So I got back up and I said, ladies and gentlemen, my friend here, and he was a friend of mine. We had gone to coffee and all this kind of stuff. He was a real nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, my friend says that Jesus came to establish the kingdom, but he couldn't do it because of Jewish unbelief. So God postponed the kingdom count, but that's not a failure. And it's not even a change of plans. Not really. So I said, let's imagine the following scenario. I said, I happen to know that Don doesn't make much money, but let's imagine the following scenario. He and his wife sit down and say, we want to go to Hawaii. We cannot afford it any way, shape, form, or fashion. We're going to start saving today to go to Hawaii. It's going to take us 10 years. If we save X amount of money every week, every month, every year, for the next 10 years, we're going to be able to go to Hawaii in 10 years. So I said, let's imagine after 9 years and 11 months, the motor blows up in Don's car. And it takes every single dime of their savings to fix the car. And so Don has to walk in and say, honey, man, I really, really hate to tell you this. We can't go to Hawaii after all because the motor blew up the car. And we got to use all of our savings to fix it because we got to have our car. And the wife's going, no, 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 no. And he said, no, 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 don't worry about it. This is not a change of plans. We'll just have to save for another 20 years. But that's okay. We're not changing our plans. And I said, I turned to him and I said, Don, do you think you could convince your wife that that would not be a serious change of plans? You don't think, or do you think you could convince her that your original plan did not fail? He didn't say a word, naturally. And the audience just lost it. I mean, everybody could see you can't make that argument without contradicting yourself and contradicting scripture, more importantly. So
And that would have been a very sensitive issue for the wives,
oh my, yeah. Try to convince her this is not a failure. Yeah. Now I want to shift gears just a little bit. And the reason I want to do this, William, there's an irony in the theological world, in the evangelical world, that you and I have talked about this a good little bit. This irony goes something like this. The amillennialists have their view, the postmillennialists have their view, the premillennialists have their view, and they all call each other brother and they have kumbaya. They hug each other and say, look, doesn't matter. We're all brethren. We're not going to divide over any of this. But now these preterists are absolute total heretics. Just today, I stumbled on the internet an interview between Sam Frost and this guy. I've forgotten his name now. I've got the interview highlighted in my favorites. And the interviewer felt it necessary to lay some groundwork. And he said, now, Sam, you are an amillennialist. Is that correct? Yeah, that's what I am now. He said, well, I am a dispensational premillennialist. But he said, we want our audience to know that we're brethren, right? And that we love each other, right? And that we're in fellowship with one another, right? Yep. But we want everybody to know that these folks who call themselves full preterists, they're not Christians. They are not our brothers. We're not in fellowship with one another. Now, William, here's an amillennialist. Doesn't matter of what stripe they are, an amillennialist. They believe that the doctrine of a failed Messiah is a horrid, horrid gospel denying doctrine, right?
Right.
How then can they reach out and embrace a dispensational premillennialist who believes that Jesus did fail? How can they do that?
I don't know how they justify it among themselves. It's the cognitive dissonance, I guess, the um, failure to bring that to the forefront of their consciousness when they're thinking about it. And then I guess the abhorrence they have of the preterist view that makes them feel like, we can all be against them. And then perhaps as some justify it, they say, well, we're all futurists. We can have our different viewpoints, but we're all futurists. We all believe that Christ is coming back at some time in the future. And that's one way that they seek to justify it.
I agree that is one way they seek to justify it, but in getting there to that umbrella statement of, well, we all agree the future holds the second coming.
Mm-hmm.
One of them says Jesus failed. He couldn't do what he came to do. He supposedly came at just the right time to do it, but he couldn't do it. So next time around, he'll come at just the right time. And the amillennialists and the postmillennialists are sitting back going, you can't say he came at just the right time, but he failed. That's not the gospel of Christ.
Right.
But hey, kumbaya. Let's all hug. Let's have a group hug. As long as they feel like they can condemn the preterists. And that to me is one of I will call it a dark irony for which I find no justification. I find that it's hypocritical because Kenneth Gentry has debated dispensational premillennialist,
Mm-hmm.
and considers that doctrine to be horrible. He's written against it extensively as anti-gospel. And yet he will say to them, well, as long as you're a futurist, you're okay. Even if you do say Jesus failed, even if you do say that Jesus couldn't do what the Father gave him to do, so he postponed the kingdom, and the church is not the purpose of God after all. You can say that if you want to. We don't agree with it, but as long as you don't like the preterists, then we're okay with you. I just find that to be such a self-contradiction, such an amazing irony that I think people need to be aware of what's going on out there in the futurist camp. They're willing to pat each other on the back under that umbrella of, oh, we're all futurists. All the while, they absolutely abhor and believe that each other's doctrine. Now, I can understand the amillennialist and the postmillennialist saying, we're awfully close to one another.
Mm-hmm.
About the only difference between us, the amillennialist believes the world is going to just keep getting worse and worse and worse until Christ comes, while the postmillennialist says, oh, no, the world's going to keep getting better and better and better. There's not a whole lot of difference other than that between them. So I can understand them both shaking hands and saying, okay, we'll get along. But how both of those schools can then shake the hand in fellowship of dispensational premillennialists who, as we've already pointed out numerous times tonight, say that Jesus, their doctrine says, even if they don't want to say it in those words, their doctrine says Jesus failed, God's purposes failed, the prophetic scriptures failed, but that's okay. Makes no sense to me.
It doesn't. It really doesn't.
Okay, William. So the premillennialists say that the church is an emergency interim measure. Remember, folks, God's plan, according to the dispensationalists, was for Jesus to come to establish the kingdom, to reign on earth for a literal 1,000 years. And I have to refer to Thomas Ice again. Thomas Ice says had the Jews not rejected Jesus, he would have established the earthly kingdom and ruled on earth for 1,000 years. William, okay, this is a bit of a digression, but I have to point this out. And I've raised this issue with premillennialists before who have just parroted Thomas Ice's comments. If the Jews would have accepted Jesus, would there have been any necessity for a second coming?
No. If the Jews had rejected him?
If the Jews,
are you saying if the Jews had accepted him?
If the Jews would have accepted him, Thomas Ice said he would have established the kingdom and ruled on earth. So if that be the case, would there have been any need, any necessity whatsoever for a second coming of Christ?
Well, maybe from their perspective, I would think they would say no, but I don't see how they could justify that in view of what's taking place. They would be saying the kingdom had come if he had been accepted.
Yep.
So they would have had the kingdom. And that, to me, from that perspective, would rule out the need for a coming to establish the kingdom.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
I have asked any number of dispensationalists to explain this to me. I have yet to receive an answer. If Jesus had not failed, if he would have established the kingdom, he would never have left. He would have stayed on earth for 1,000 years. No second coming. But wait, the second coming is posited as the time of salvation. So they would tell us that all of the constituent elements of the kingdom, salvation, redemption, forgiveness, etc., would have taken place on earth if the Jews would have accepted Jesus. Dispensational premillennialism, logically, now look, folks, they don't accept it because they don't talk about it. And they don't want to think about it because it distorts the entire New Testament narrative. But the fact is, every constituent element of eschatology and soteriology would have been present had the Jews accepted Jesus. There would have been no reason for him whatsoever to go away. He went away. Why? Well, because the Jews rejected him. He was crucified, buried, resurrected, and went back to the Father there to await the time when he would come again to do what, according to dispensationalism? Oh, establish the kingdom. So they have no explanation for this. They cannot explain why Christ will come again unless he failed the first time. They can't explain that. At least I've never had one explain it. And they cannot explain what would happen if Christ would have been accepted. Would he have ever left? I've never had one explain that.
Yeah, and then they've got to go back and explain the prophecies that talk about his dying in order to obtain the redemption that was necessary. And not only was that in the prophets, that's in the Gospels as well, where he stated it over and over again that it was necessary for this to occur. And it's, as you've taught before, and as we see in the scriptures, that it was actually satanic for them to resist the fact that he was to go to the cross and die. So that says a lot about their doctrine just within that particular verse.
Absolutely right. I mean, when you talk about the prophetic scriptures, we can toss in on top of that as a double helping of serving is the feast days.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Passover. Jesus Christ is our Passover, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. So from the very initiation of the nation of Israel, it foretold the sacrifice of Jesus, the death of Jesus. And yet the death of Jesus supposedly prevented the accomplishment of God's purposes on earth. Pentecost. the Feast of First Fruits.
Mhm.
You know, every single one of the feast days foretold either the incarnate passion of Christ or the second coming. Rosh Hashanah, the coming of the Lord in judgment. Yom Kippur, the second coming in judgment. Hello, Sukkot. What is Sukkot? Harvest, coming of the Lord, end of the age. So from the very beginning, pardon me, of Israel's national polity, you have embedded in the feast days the narrative, the entire narrative of Jesus's ministry from his incarnation to his parousia at the end of the age.
Mhm.
It's all there. How
And
can,
that's
yeah, go ahead.
such a very powerful paradigm, not just for the dispensationalists, but for all shades of eschatology. I mean, if you miss the feast days and their significance, you've really missed the essence of what Jesus is coming is all about, both first and his second coming, because it's all laid out there, as you say. So the amillennialist ignores that or fails to perceive it. The post-millennialists, as well as the dispensational premillennialists, just failed to acknowledge that particular aspect of it. And yet it's laid out so beautifully when you see it. I remember, I was telling you the previous week when we were talking about, our trips, I was sharing that point with the gentleman as we were discussing, resurrection, not resurrection, but the book of Revelation. And so when I pointed out to him that, Christ had come and that all these things were fulfilled, that was his go-to verse, of course. And as you know, many of their go-to verse, it's Matthew 24:36. He didn't ask for Matthew 24:36 particularly. He asked about Acts 1, 6 and 7. And I told him that, that's the same verse as Matthew 24:36 and 1 Thessalonians 5. And when I walked him through the feast days about it and eventually got to that unknown day, I mean, it was like he didn't know what to think about it. It kind of blew him away, but he sat, receptive to it. It's just that it never really dawned on him to even consider it.
Well, I don't have to tell you, you know this very, very well. You touched on it ever so briefly there a moment ago. In the amillennial world, there virtually no thought is given to the subject of the feast days and eschatology.
Mhm.
They talk about the Passover. Okay, that's Christ. Feast of unleavened bread. That's the resurrection of Jesus. Feast of first fruits, etc. Oh, I heard some lessons on that when I was a young man. No great big development of it, but it was just like, boy, there's some beautiful harmony here. Nothing whatsoever, not a word about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. Not a word.
But even then, if you talk Pentecost, that's going to run counter to their law fulfilled at the cross, paradigm.
Just a little bit, yeah. Of course it does. But it just shows you how profoundly deep tradition runs that prevents people from even looking at the subject.
Mm-hmm.
William, when I began studying these feast days, after hearing David Curtis and after visiting with Bill Cannengeiser a good bit, and I started sharing some of this with our Church of Christ brethren, talk about the deer in the headlight look.
Yeah.
And I had people, and when I would say something about it in one of my YouTube videos, I would have Church of Christ members say, "You're teaching heresy. The feast days have nothing to do with the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection." And I mean, boy, they just tie into me and come at me with both barrels blaring. Well, when I would explain it to them, all of a sudden they would disappear. There's a guy who basically stalks me on YouTube. He's an older fella and what have you. And he just thinks I am the world's, he probably thinks that I am the man of sin. Truth be known. But he calls me every name imaginable from the Bible to call me a false teacher, heretic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, you know, And this older fella could not delineate, could not offer an explication or a development of Israel's feast days and their relationship to eschatology if his soul depended on it. Because according to him, Christ accomplished everything that the Father gave him to do by John chapter 17.
Mm-hmm.
Which means, of course, he hadn't, even though he hadn't died, he'd already done it. Even though he hadn't been raised from the dead, he'd already accomplished everything. Even though he hadn't established the church, he had already done everything. Even though he had not yet poured out the Holy Spirit, to raise Israel from the dead, he had already accomplished everything. I mean, that's how ridiculous and how illogical, the guy is. But the feast days are they're so far above his head. And I'm not trying to be unkind, but you and I both know his background in the amillennial world that gives no thought. They have never even studied or imagined the relationship between the feast days and eschatology. And so it's just absolutely astounding how far removed the modern evangelical Christianity is from the narrative. So that's why it's so troubling to me when we come to the dispensational world and they tell us that the church is this emergency interim measure. Because to go back to what you just mentioned, and that's Pentecost. What did it represent, William? What was the symbolism and the prefiguring of Pentecost?
Pentecost was one thing that was involved in Pentecost was the time of the giving of the law in the Old Covenant, but it's also, the time of the preaching of the gospel as far as the New Covenant was concerned. But it was also a time of the first fruits related to the harvest, the second portion of first fruits. In Exodus 23:19, it talks about the first of the first fruits. And that was the time of the barley harvest. That message was imprinted in my mind, as you say, from Bill Cannengeiser at that Oklahoma conference, and I never forgot it.
Blew my mind.
And then on that 50th day, Pentecost, after the 7 Sabbaths, you had the wheat harvest. And so those were the grain harvests, and that's being represented there, and that's what Pentecost was all about. And so that reflects the church being raised from the dead, raised out of sin, at least from an inception point of view, a beginning point of view. And so they are called first fruits from that perspective. Okay,
then let's pick that up. Since Pentecost was the Feast of First Fruits, and it was the establishment of the church. And by the way, dispensationalists agree with this. The church was established on Pentecost. Okay, well, if the church was established on Pentecost, the church was established on Pentecost. That sounds redundant, and it sounds simply repetitious, but if the church was established on Pentecost in fulfillment of the feast typological significance of the Feast of First Fruits, William, doesn't that mean that the church was actually prophesied via means of the Feast of First Fruits?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, then what happens to the dispensational doctrine that says, oh, the church is not foretold anywhere in the Old Testament?
It just goes by the wayside. I mean, it's just totally untrue that's that it's not prophesied there, that it's not a part of it. Even when you talk about, the seed of Abraham and Christ, it's there in so many different ways that the church is there, but particularly with the feast days. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, the dispensationalist. And what's so interesting is they have a better grasp of the feast days than the amillennialists do.
Or the postmillennialists.
Yeah, and have written books on it, understand the meaning of them, but they don't, they're not able to put them into the proper framework to see their fulfillment. It's always something out in the future. It's always something that hasn't taken place in terms of the the fall festivals as far as that goes, the end time.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they're all eschatological, really, because they
Yeah.
all deal with the last days.
Let me pick up on that because that's really, really critical. You made a point there that is absolutely, and I'm talking powerfully true, that the dispensationalists have a better grasp of the significance of the feast days than both the amillennial and postmillennialists. I mean, there are some premillennial teachers that have done some what I consider to be absolutely incredible studies on the typological significance of the feast days. One dispensational writer, I'm struggling to remember his name at this moment, like you were there a moment ago, but he says the first 4 feast days were graphically, that's his word, were graphically fulfilled right on time, just as foretold in the incarnation, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and the day of Pentecost. Okay, back to the question. If the first 4 feast days were, quote, graphically fulfilled right on time, according to dispensationalists, then back to the point I made just a moment ago, since the church was established on Pentecost in fulfillment of the day of Pentecost typology, then that means there was no postponement of the kingdom offer. It means that the church was the fulfillment of the kingdom offer,
Yes.
because you can't have Pentecost foreshadowing a failure. I mean, that just makes no sense whatsoever. You cannot have Pentecost foreshadowing not only a postponement, but a failure. It was the first fruits. And as you pointed out, Leviticus 23:19, Christ had already become the first fruit of the first fruit. Well, that means that his death was the fulfillment of prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a failure.
Mark Biltz, I think. Mark Biltz is the author I was thinking of.
Mark Biltz.
He did this blood moons book on blood moons, but he goes through, at least in the first part of the book, he goes through all the feast days and does a pretty good job.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that.
That's the one I was thinking about.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll think of the one that I was thinking about here. Remember his name here in just a moment. But everywhere you look in the first 4 feast days, it was typological and foreshadowing the appearance of Christ, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and the Feast of First Fruits. All of those were supposedly things that were unforeseen and unpredicted by the Old Testament in order to bring the church into existence. Because remember, according to the dispensational paradigm, the church was an unpredicted, unforeseen, unplanned interim measure. I'm sorry if this sounds repetitious, but since the first 4 feast days foretold the death, burial, resurrection of Christ and the day of Pentecost, then it foretold, the rejection of Christ, his exaltation through resurrection, and his establishment of the church, all graphically fulfilled on time as foretold. Where in the world do you get the idea of a postponement? Where in the world would you ever get the idea of an interim measure, since Pentecost is what was planned?
Yeah, and this was so indelibly ingrained into Israel from the perspective that they had to revisit this every year.
Oh, yeah.
So you're going to embed within them this commemorative, celebratory event, only to let them know that you're practicing for failure. That just doesn't make any sense.
that's a joyful bit of good news.
Yeah.
Yeah. And folks, what we're trying to do here is to show that the entire dispensational paradigm, which says that the church was an emergency in a measure, is built on false premises. It says Jesus failed. It says Jesus couldn't accomplish. But the first four feast days, we are told by the dispensationalists, were fulfilled graphically right on time. But the first four feast days were prophetic of Jesus's death, burial, resurrection, and the establishment of the church, the ingathering of the first fruit harvest. Those are not failures. They didn't point to failures, William just said. They were played out in perfection and in fulfillment. How then can it possibly be argued that since the Old Testament's feast days foretold the very events that dispensationalists tell us were fulfilled right on time, just the right way, how can they then argue, oh, the day of Pentecost and the establishment of the church was an oops on the part of God? Didn't plan on this, folks. I'm really sorry. I didn't intend for this to happen. And yet, as I have pointed out on this program before, Peter in Acts chapter 2, 32 through 36, quotes Psalms 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And he applies that to Christ, raised from the dead, enthroned in the heavens at the right hand of the throne. And William, I've been studying dispensational literature most of my almost adult and adult life. Every single dispensational writer that I have ever read says Psalms 110 was being fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. Well, wait a minute. That means that the day of Pentecost, to reiterate one more time, the establishment of the church was predicted in Psalms 110. Where's the failure there? I've intended to do this several times. I never have, but I've intended to go through Acts chapter 2 alone, and just list every single Old Testament prophet or prophecy that was fulfilled on that particular day.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I've got Grok, that would be pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do that because that will be, I know it will be very, very impressive. That's something to look forward to, folks. Okay, so once again, here's the dispensational paradigm. Christ came to do something, couldn't do it. The Lord established the church as this emergency interim measure. But William, when God made the promises to Abraham, he promised Abraham that he would inherit the world, Romans 4:13. And I want you to answer a question for us here momentarily. But he promised him a heavenly city, a heavenly country, and a better resurrection. So first of all, I had somebody, and I just now remembered this. I haven't gotten back to the lady who asked the questions. She always asks wonderful questions. So we can discuss it here very quickly. What is the, quote, world, unquote, that Abraham was promised?
That's the new heavens and the new earth.
Okay.
That's the inheritance.
All right.
It's salvation.
Okay.
It's the church.
And Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So, mm-hmm. And the point that I wanted to bring out, and like I said, I just now remembered getting this lady's question. I apologize to her. I won't call her name. But when God made the promise that in him and his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed, the world that Abraham knew at that time was pretty small, wasn't it?
Correct.
But when Paul comes along, 19 centuries later, and he says Abraham was given the promise to inherit the world. By this time, the world has expanded exponentially. And yet Paul is applying the Abrahamic promise to his world. So Paul was not confining the promise of Abraham to that tiny little sliver of the Middle East, as we call it today, of the ancient Near East. Paul was not interpreting the promise of the world to that little sliver of geography. He has expanded it exponentially to include what he calls the world, the oikumene, as well as the cosmos. And by the way, we now know, historians now know, that the Romans came into contact, and of course, this is not controversial. Asia was included in that. Pardon me. And it's now strongly suspected, and there's some historical sources, that there was actually contact, limited perhaps, but contact between the Romans and China. And Paul believed that the gospel was intended for the whole world.
Well, you have in Isaiah 49 the mention of Sinim, right?
Yes.
Which is understood to be China, as far as I understand.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. And so even though that contact might have been somewhat limited, it's not like they had vast contacts, but there was certainly contact going on. And so I just thought it was an interesting question, perhaps the ladies watching tonight, because to reiterate the point, and I think it's a very important point, for Paul, the promise that Abraham would inherit the world was not limited to Abraham's own very, very limited geographical knowledge. Was not at all. It included Paul's world. And what would that mean when Jesus said, go into all the world? Did that mean, I don't want you going anywhere that you don't know the people already. I only want you to go to people that you already know. Or was Paul possibly saying, and this gets very interesting when we study how the apostles died and where they died. Some of the apostles died in really, really, really far-flung places. And so it's an interesting question, to contemplate, but it gives rise to the idea that in the mind of God, the world that Abraham was due to inherit kept expanding. That's the point I want to make. You think that's a valid point?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So here we have the Abrahamic promise, and you've already touched on it very briefly there. So he was promised the world, heavenly city, heavenly country, better resurrection. William, you used the terminology. Abraham was promised the new heaven and the new earth. Now, here's where it gets really, really, really critical for the dispensational doctrine of the postponement doctrine and of the church being the interim measure. Let me see how to frame this question. Are you aware, William, I think you are, but are you aware that even dispensationalists viewed the age of Moses and the law as an interim measure before the establishment of the Davidic kingdom?
I can see, yes, I would say that they do, yes, for sure.
Okay. The reason for that being, I'm not aware of any dispensationalist. Now I take that back. I made a comment along this very line just briefly. I think it was on one of my YouTube Now TV videos, and in which I said, I'm not aware of any dispensationalist that believes that the law of Moses will ever be restored. And this one guy wrote back to me and he said, absolutely, the law of Moses is going to be restored. And I was like, well, okay, there you go. Okay. Every time you say nobody believes a certain thing, somebody jumps up and said, well, I do. Yeah. So anyway, 99.9.9.9% of all dispensationalists believe the law of Moses was fulfilled and taken out of the way in the first century. That's Thomas Ice's position. That was Tim LaHaye's position. That was Dwight Pentecost's position. That was Merrill Unger's view, on and on and on it goes. Even among the progressive dispensationalists, Darrell Bach and those like him, they agree the law of Moses was done away. Therefore, my point is that in dispensationalism, the law of Moses was not an emergency, but it was nonetheless an interim measure to exist until the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Well, wait a minute. The law of Moses ended in the first kingdom, or in the first century. All dispensationalists agree with that, with maybe one personal exception. Since the law of Moses did end, and since the Messianic kingdom was supposed to come at the end of the Mosaic kingdom, then that most assuredly means the church, which was established at the end of the Mosaic kingdom, one of two possibilities. Okay, dispensationalists say, oh, well, the church was only established as the emergency measure, kingdom failed, kingdom was postponed, etc. Or maybe, just maybe, since the church, as we've already pointed out, was predicted through the feast days as part and parcel of God's eschatological narrative, since the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom was established or foretold in the first 4 feast days, then that means that what happened on Pentecost was not an interim measure. Right?
That's correct.
Okay. So that criteria of the kingdom coming at the end of the law of Moses, although Pentecost was not the end of the law of Moses for sure, but nonetheless, the idea of law of Moses kingdom played out on the day of Pentecost. But instead, the law of Moses, an interim measure, was discontinued. The church was established as another emergency interim measure. So in reality, dispensationalism has 2 interim measures. Now that raises the question of, where do we find that in the Bible? I don't find 2 measures, 2 interim measures. And that takes us back to Galatians chapter 3, does it not, William?
Right.
16 and following. And we've only got 2 minutes. But walk us through very, very quickly Galatians 3, 18 and following, in which Paul tells us that the Abrahamic promise of the new heaven and new earth, and we'll have to pick this, pardon me, we'll have to pick this up next week to identify the Abrahamic inheritance as indeed the new heaven and new earth, and to show the implications of that for dispensationalism, because dispensationalism completely misplaces the Abrahamic promise. So anyway, here is Paul in Galatians 3, 18 and following, telling us something about when the Abrahamic promise would be established, when it could not be given. Share that with us very, very quickly.
All right. Well, it could not be given under the law, because he says if the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer of promise. And so that separates it from the law. He says, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. And therefore, what purpose did the law serve? It was added because of transgressions till the seed should come. And so till the fulfillment should come through Christ. And as you and I have discussed before, we're talking about his parousia in that verse. Then that shows when the new heaven and earth arrived. It shows when those things were fulfilled, and therefore showing that the promise came through Christ after the law was fulfilled.
And that completely and totally disrupts the dispensational paradigm. And next week, we will talk about the new heaven and new earth as the Abrahamic inheritance and how the dispensationalist paradigm completely and totally misses the point of the new heaven and the new earth. They put the new heaven and new earth at the end of the millennium. Well, I agree with that 100%. But dispensationalism fails to see where Scripture puts the arrival of the new heaven and new earth from Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, and Revelation. We'll do that next week. In the meantime, good study, William. Appreciate your thoughts as always. Thanks for being with me. And folks, thank you for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'll say good night. God bless.
All right. Good night.